In a survey from LinkedIn and Forrester Consulting, 90% of sales and marketing professionals agreed that teams are misaligned across culture, strategy, process, and content, even though 90% also agree that alignment is better for the customer. From increasing competition to unpredictable markets, revenue operations leaders seemingly face a new host of challenges just about every day. These rapidly evolving challenges are only exacerbated by a long-standing problem among sales and marketing teams, which is that of misalignment. Perhaps a better way to efficient growth would be a system that flags what's not working so you can fix issues proactively. Our guest today has built such a platform, and we'll be exploring how we can make efficient growth happen. Hello, and welcome to the Predictable B2B Success podcast, brought to you by sproutwith.com. I'm Vinay Koshy, and our guest today is Scott Stouffer. Scott, I believe you're a 5-time CEO, 3-time founder, currently the CEO and founder of Scale Matters, which is a company that delivers go-to-market operations, analytics, and insights to help businesses drive capital-efficient growth. Scott, you're also the co-host of the Data Room podcast, and you took your first company, Visual Networks, public in 2001, grew it to a peak market cap of $3 billion. And since 2011, you've been focused very much on early and growth stage tech companies, building quantitative data and process models that uncover waste, inefficiency, and friction in go-to-market functions. Now, in your last company, Salsa Labs, I believe is where you started to come up with this idea of Scale Matters, but your methods were methods of managing go-to-market were so effective that you managed things like a 71% CAC reduction and a 47% faster sales cycle in just 6 months. I'm curious, Scott, what was it like before you had Scale Matters as we know it today? Was it very much a manual process? How were you able to deal with all the complexities and the numbers that needed to go into all of this to make it efficient?
Yeah, first of all, thanks for having me, Vinay. I'm pleased and honored to be with you on your show here, and I know you cover some very important stuff, so I'm glad to be able to participate in it. So, yeah, you mentioned my prior company, Salsa Labs. We were one of the industry leaders in marketing automation and CRM for nonprofits. And specifically, we focused on kind of the smaller end, think of it as the SMB equivalent of nonprofit organizations. And they're a great customer to serve, but they're a tough customer type to build a great economic model around, because they tend to be low pay, high touch, a lot of churn that goes on just amongst those business organizations. And we basically concluded that for our company to be able to optimize its value, et cetera, we really needed to get aggressive about reducing the cost of acquisition. In a traditional SaaS business, most people talk about LTV to CAC as one of the guiding North Star metrics, and the LTV part of that equation, there wasn't a whole lot we could do about that. So we said, we think we can actually focus on improving the CAC to improve that overall ratio. And what we found when we first set out to do that is that our data wasn't very good. And what do I mean by that? We had typical tech stack like everybody else. HubSpot is our marketing automation platform. Salesforce is our CRM. We use SalesLoft as a cadence tool, Gong as a call recording tool, et cetera. And they were put together okay, but we had never really consciously thought about what data do we really need to be able to manage the go-to-market motion with an extraordinary level of precision. And so when we started thinking that way, because we knew we had to find friction, and we had to basically, when we talk about getting more efficient at something, we tend to, I don't know if you've ever read the book, The Goal by Eli Goldratt, but it's all about this thing called theory of constraints. And the short part of theory of constraints is you need to attack the constraints. You need to find the friction and remove the friction. That's how you become more efficient, right? And so we had that mentality at Salsa, but we didn't have a good way of finding the friction, right? We had some gut level views of what was what was working, maybe what wasn't working, but we didn't have it with enough precision that it became actionable. Right. And so what we basically set out to do is we said, look, let's deconstruct our go-to-market motion and model it out and map it at a kind of an excruciating level of detail, right? So we had conversion rates for every stage of opportunity, cycle times for every stage of opportunity, conversion rates through each sort of rating and status of lead by different types of sourcing, et cetera, and built these very sophisticated models, which effectively said, this is how we think we're going to get there. But then we needed to be able to measure at that same level of granularity. And so what we did is we reconfigured our tech stack really with the primary goal of how do we turn this into a strategic instrumentation asset, if you will, that produces data at the same level of granularity that we were able to model our motion so that we could compare those two, actual versus modeled behavior. And we did that. And it started producing a lot of data. And unfortunately, we didn't have a great way to analyze all that data. And so literally, and keep in mind, I was the CEO of this company, literally for the first hour of every day, I would be downloading reports out of Salesforce into Excel or out of HubSpot into Excel, manipulating the data, right, in a way that it started to surface things. And the good news is that it started to surface a bunch of friction and a bunch of points of inefficiency. And it did it in a way that we could understand, all right, which ones were the most constraining. And then we would effectively, you talked a lot about alignment in your introduction. We would align the entire acquisition, so the entire sales and marketing function around these points of inefficiency, regardless of where they were in a funnel, right? If our biggest constraining issue at any given time was moving from proposal stage deep in the pipeline to negotiations, we got everybody involved on that. I didn't care whether we were driving more top of funnel from marketing. If we couldn't get this other constraining area fixed, we didn't need more top of funnel. So it served to really align the company around what's important at this particular time to fix. And ultimately, we ended up running a whole bunch of experiments to attack these various points of inefficiency or points of friction and start knocking them off one after another. And sure enough, in about a year's time, as you mentioned, we were able to reduce our cost of acquisition by almost 70% and shrink the sales cycle almost in half. And that was transformative for that company. And we ended up selling it to Excel KR, a very positive outcome. And when we sold it, there were a few of us at Salsa that decided, look, what we've just done here as a process, if you will, was transformational for the company. We can actually build IP to productize this and to automate this whole process of optimizing for go-to-market, which we just did. And that really was the genesis of Scale Matters, was to build some IP so that we could automate this whole process of optimizing go-to-market and then make that available to all these other companies.
Incredible story. Thank you for that. I'm also curious, you obviously had quite a journey to date, and you've just given us a taste of that. So what would you say would be your personal area of strength?
Oh, geez, I don't know. I've been at a long time, as you can probably tell simply by looking at me. When I started my first company, Visual Networks, which was actually back in 1993, I would have said for certain my strength was product and product vision. I've always had a kind of a preference for product strategy, product vision type stuff. I'm an engineer by training. I see a problem, I want to fix it. But after 30 years of now being in a CEO role and running companies, what I've developed as my go-to strength is really basically a quantitative approach to running business. And I do believe, particularly in the tech world, that there's so much winging it and operating on gut feel. And that if you add more legitimate data into the picture that you can start to manage companies with a lot more precision. And it doesn't actually slow companies down, it speeds them up. So I think I've developed a strength. I think on my LinkedIn profile, I call myself a quant CEO. So I'm very analytical, very data focused, and I believe it helps to make not only our company, but help other companies that we touch become much more precise and efficient at achieving their goals.
I was going to ask you, in that area of strength, what is it that businesses don't know but should? And you've obviously alluded to the fact that having legitimate data brought to the table could help clear up some of these problems. Is there anything else that you would add to that?
There's a long list, but let's explore the data thing a little bit more. By the way, the other thing, and certainly over the last 10 to 15 years that I've probably put more of my mental focus on within these companies is the whole go-to-market side of the function. And with good reason, which is in these early and growth stage tech companies, go-to-market is consuming the vast majority of the precious capital that companies raise. And I think it's really important to be good stewards of that capital and try to get rid of the waste and really get the most substantial return you can out of all that money you spend on sales and marketing. And what happens, unfortunately, in so many cases is companies spend a ton of money on sales and marketing. 50% or more of it is completely non-productive. And so they end up getting to the end of their runway, their capital runway, and they haven't necessarily achieved the types of milestones that they need to be able to raise more money. So they end up going out of business or having a fire sale. So to the extent that we can help change that dynamic, that's a little bit of a mission of ours. But you asked about, besides getting better at data, what else have I learned with the need for some of these companies to be more effective? And I would say it's still getting better with data, but it's not just having good data. It's having leadership teams that actually value data as the source of informing them to make decisions. And again, we tend to operate, and if you think about my last 30 years, the largest company that I had was maybe 125 million in annual sales. So my world I play in is 0 to, let's call it 150 million. By definition, those are not huge companies. And by definition, the leadership teams at these companies are often not terribly experienced. And I think it takes a lot of experience to start to learn that gut feel doesn't always work, and that there is an ability to be better informed, and that you have to actually put energy into searching that out, out what do we need to be better informed. And I think too many companies and too many leadership teams just go through the same old motions over and over again. So it's data, but it's also people who are sensitive to the value that can be gained from data.
Absolutely. You were saying before that there is a real need to bring legitimate data to the table to make efficient growth happen. I'd be interested in hearing your thoughts around what a lot of, especially marketing folk, say is the need for multi-touch attribution to measure marketing influence.
So the way you framed the question is how I'm specifically going to answer it. In particular, why I said that is because you said to measure marketing influence. To me, that's a who cares. And why I say that, that's just an internal issue. And yet that is the primary reason we see so many marketers focused on wanting some kind of multi-touch attribution, is because they so desperately want to be able to say, we had something to do with getting that sale. And, you know, it's almost like there's a societal negative view of marketers, right? At least in the tech world. And as a result, marketers have developed this insecurity that they need to constantly prove that they had something to do with revenue. So think about that for a second. What has more to do with revenue than anything else in a company? The product you sell. Do you see the engineers or the product managers spending any of their emotional energy every day trying to prove that they had something to do with a sale happening? No, nor do leadership teams put that expectation on it. And we shouldn't do that. We shouldn't put that expectation on the marketing folks either, because it's too hard to measure. You have to fundamentally believe that brand is important. Brand awareness and brand reputation is important to make the process of selling easier. Demand generation is important, right? Because unless you happen to have some super rich partner channel that's producing all this top of funnel, or your sales team are self-generating pipeline people, then somebody's got to generate leads and pipeline, right? That's all important. But that doesn't require multi-touch attribution, right? That requires being very good at understanding the channels you're investing in, the campaigns you're investing in, and are they producing any leads? The where I do think there's value, and it's not so much multi-touch attribution value, but if you think about, there are channels we use, let's call a channel paid search, paid LinkedIn, events, G2, listing services. These are all marketing channels that we can invest in. Then there are offers, right? Basically, what is it you're trying to get a prospect to take up? Maybe there's a webinar, maybe there's a newsletter, right? Maybe there's a white paper, maybe there's a demo. These are all offers in my view. I think it's important to understand which offers get the best response from people who are in your ICP. I think it's important to understand which channels tend to be the drinking holes for people in your ICP where they hang out. And that's all very important stuff. But it's not important. First of all, it's unrealistic, but it's not terribly important to know that this sale that we ultimately made, yeah, it came in as a demo request from paid search ads. That's very important. But it's not really that important to understand that. And during the 45-day sales cycle, we also sent them 2 emails, and they signed up for 1 webinar, which they didn't attend. Because even if you send them stuff during the sales process and they open it, you can see that they opened it. You can't claim that influenced them. Think about influence. Influence means it caused somebody's mind to think differently about something. And all marketers are able to do today is potentially tell that an impression of something got in front of somebody, and maybe they opened it. They have no way of knowing that had anything to do with influencing the sale. So I think the reason I'm so against it is because of how much energy gets spent by marketers trying to actually come up with a multi-touch attribution measurement mechanism, which is virtually impossible, and how little energy is spent by marketers on things like messaging. So, for example, changing subject here a little bit, but it's all related to multi-touch attribution and really my frustration with where marketers spend a lot of their time. Over the last 6 years, there's been a revolution in terms of call recording, conversation, gong, chorus, wingman, exec vision. Everybody has them now, right? And of course, these companies have grown tremendously because the sales management has recognized those as a valuable way to better help develop their salespeople at scale, right? Because they certainly can't sit and listen in on every single call, right? So it's a scalable approach for sales management to do sales management. It's also this treasure trove of data for marketers to figure out how to dial in their messaging and who exactly is their ICP, right? So you can sit there and say, I'm going to run A/B tests on my website, or I'm going to try these 2 different email campaigns and see what response rates we get. none of that data or feedback you're getting compares to just spend your time listening to these calls with prospects. And you're going to learn so much more to dial in your messaging. And we do a lot of work with our customers, particularly our customers that have Gong, to leverage it to basically really identify marketing mismatches or gaps between their messaging and their ICP and who they're targeting, et cetera. And how often do you hear of marketers that are doing that? Hardly ever. But that's really where there are big wins to be gained. And stop wasting all your time worrying about whether someone opened a webinar invite before they downloaded this resource, none of which they're probably reading or paying attention to anyway. So anyway, enough of my soapbox on that. But I do think it's just a terrible waste of energy that so many marketing organizations do. And then, of course, that whole concept of needing to measure marketing influence, by definition, it causes misalignment. Let's go back to how you opened the podcast. It's, I don't know, this is maybe a bad analogy, but I'm going to use US football, right? North American football. It's like the offensive tackle having to take credit for something. It's a team game. Who cares, right? We want to win. We want to win as a team. We don't need to make sure that one particular person gets credit because by definition, by wanting to claim credit, you're saying somebody else can't claim credit for it, right? And that causes misalignment.
I like that point that you make. So would you say that a go-to-market leader should really be best friends, if I could put it that way, with data, RevOps, customer success, and product?
Absolutely. I think good sales leaders should be very data focused too, but I believe there are more dials to turn in the top of funnel than there are in the bottom of funnel. And therefore, I think the very best marketing leaders are extraordinarily data focused, but it's not, again, but many of them miss the opportunity to be data focused around messaging. And if you think about it, messaging is almost job one of marketing.
That's interesting. A lot of people talk a lot about the metrics and measuring
QLs. Yeah, they talk about all the lead counts and stuff like that. And of course, part of the reason there's so much misalignment is marketing's flooding this stuff with what they call MQLs, and salespeople look at them and they think they're just garbage because marketing people, maybe they have an incentive to reach a certain number of MQLs. And so they decide, they define what an MQL is and go in and adjust scoring mechanisms in HubSpot or Marketo or anything. And suddenly we get all these MQLs, which maybe are not particularly good ICP fit prospects, right? And then salespeople end up spending their time, they're getting hammered to be responsive to follow up on them, and they see that they're all garbage. Right. And so they're just measuring the wrong stuff. Measure data that helps you understand precisely who your ICP is, precisely who the best personas are. Measure data that helps you understand precisely if your messaging is connecting with those personas at your ICP. If you get all that stuff right, the rest of it will usually fall in line.
How would you measure that your messaging is actually connecting with your ideal ICP?
There's a number of different ways. If you think about traditional CPG, consumer packaged goods marketing, focus groups. Now, we don't really do that in the tech world, right? Because they're very expensive to just get a few pieces of data points. But there's two in particular, I would say. Three things that I can think of, and these are all very useful ways of doing it. Probably the least expensive way that I can think of to get some good feedback on messaging for your ICP and personas is to use a service like Winter. I'm not sure if you're familiar with them. WYNTER. Right. And it's effectively a message testing service. And so you can spend a couple grand or something like that and get feedback from 15 people who meet your ICP and persona requirements, right? I'd say next level would be and this will give you richer data, use these expert networks. I'm not sure if GuidePoint, Newton X, there's a handful of these communities that hire people like you or I to provide paid feedback. And the people that use them the most tend to be the investment firms, but companies can use them too. And you can meet with exactly the type of company you want to meet with, exactly the profile of persona you want to meet with, and run through your messaging as if you're trying to sell them. And they're paid to give you feedback, so they tend to actually be pretty honest with their feedback. So that's a way too. But the actual way I like the best is by exploiting these call recordings. Assuming your motion is one where most of the sales process is still over Zoom, and that you can record these calls. If you have an appropriate tool where you can build these fairly sophisticated trackers in, then you can do this at scale. You can see that over the last 1,000 calls, here are what the prospects have said are their priorities. Here is the language they've used, right? Start to get this really clear statistical view of what these people are that you're trying to sell to, how they think, what their language is. And that's just enormously helpful to dial in your messaging with. So all three of those things, Winter, the expert networks like GuidePoint or Newton X, or tools like Gong or Chorus, and put very good trackers into them. Those I've seen them all work wonderfully.
Brilliant. And with this idea of efficiency, do you tend to focus on key GDM metrics, especially in the SaaS world, or is it very much depends on the case situation?
In our particular case, so our whole mindset is one of removing friction. I mentioned that a little bit earlier. And so we're a data company. So we're about providing data that identifies where you have friction. And so how that friction could change at any given time. So looking at a traditional superficial SaaS metric like CAC, that's the outcome we're trying to drive, is help you lower CAC or lower CAC payback. But we don't look at that because it's too high level to tell you anything. And instead, what we want to do is we want to look at your funnel performance data. So think of it as conversion rates, cycle times, deal size, looking at that by channel, by salesperson, by industry vertical, et cetera. Those are the data points we're looking at. Now, what makes them very actionable is to add context around them. And let me talk about that a little bit. Let's say I have a conversion rate from a lead, a demo request, to a first meeting gets set up. I have a conversion rate of 40%. I tell you, Vinay, your conversion rate from demo request to first meeting is 40%. You go, okay, so it tells me nothing. Yes, you told me it's 40%, but that tells me absolutely nothing. I can't act on that. So now let's say we add a little context of time. And I say, Vinay, your conversion rate from demo request to first meeting set is 40%. It was 48% last quarter. You start to go, okay, so that's down 20%. I'm maybe a little nervous. And what you would hopefully appropriately say to me is, maybe there's some seasonality. Can you look at the same quarter last year to see if it's changed? So you're starting to want to get some context to figure out whether you have an issue here. And so maybe instead of just period over period, I say, let me give you a trend over the last 15 months. So we see this trend, and you obviously see a decrease in that conversion rate over the last 2 or 3 months. So you're really starting to now think there is an issue here. It isn't the fact that it's 40%, it's the fact that it's come way down. Now I add some more context. Let's say I've been very good at logging events. So maybe an event might be started this new ad campaign on X date. An event might be competitor X announced this new feature, right? So you start logging these events that happen that are relevant to you and map those against the trend line. you might start to realize some cause and effect, right? So that's all context. Let's go a little bit deeper on context. Plan. We talk about needing to have plan or model. So your 40% conversion rate. If your model, your plan called for that to be 30%, because you happen to know it was coming down and there's a very good reason it's coming down, and you've built your models that as long as it's above 30%, you're okay, then letting you know that, hey, your actual performance is at 40% versus your planned performance is at 30%. You, Vinay, the CEO, could say, okay, I'm not going to worry about that. Talk to me about our things we're measuring that are below plan. Right? That's where I want to focus my attention. So it's stuff like that, right? Is using data, wrapping it with context to start to surface what should I as a leadership team be worried about? Because that's where we want to focus our attention, put our brain power and say, okay, let's say we do want to worry about this particular conversion rate from demo request to first meeting setup. At least if we know that's where we need to pay attention, we can start brainstorming around what are the possible things we could do to improve that. Okay, we list these 4 things. We say, these 2 don't make any sense. We list 2 of them. All right, great. Now let's form experiments. Let's run those 2 ideas as experiments. How are we going to measure whether they're having the impact we want, et cetera, right? That's the way companies that are really good at driving efficient growth think, right? They're very good at surfacing friction, focusing on the friction, brainstorming around experiments to try to knock that friction off, and then running them in a very disciplined fashion.
Okay. So if I could put this another way, it's really boiling down to the friction around user experience and trying to improve on that in order to allow for better outcomes.
I'd say it's the friction around buyer journey.
Okay. Yeah.
Or from the point a prospective buyer first interacts with your company to the point they become a customer, right? There could be 15 different steps and stuff like that. And each one of those represents a possibility for friction. So that's one set. But there's all, I would actually say the biggest friction that exists in most of these companies, growth stage companies, is the fact they're spending money bringing in people that are not good fit prospects for them. And most companies don't do a very good job identifying that. So not only do you waste your money on the marketing side, bringing people in who are a bad fit, you then waste some money on the sales side for salespeople to actually take the time to try to sell to those companies that are bad fit. And if God forbid they actually do make the sale, if they're bad fit, they're probably going to churn because they're going to be very disappointed, and what you sold them wasn't what they thought they were getting. And so then you're going to end up spending all this excess money on the customer success side, trying to hold on to these people that were bad fit to begin with. And that whole concept is just pervasive in early and growth stage companies, and probably because there's so much pressure for growth, right? That people are willing to take any business they can get, and it's just a disaster for companies.
Obviously, you are wanting lots of data points to surface, and there are probably listeners going, we've got a bunch of tools that does provide a lot of data. Is it just a question of improving the way we analyze the data to surface up these inefficiencies, or do we really need a platform like Scale Matters in order to do this right?
I'd say there are 2 challenges most growth stage companies face when it comes to go-to-market data. The first is they actually don't have very good data. And what do I mean by that? In many cases, nobody has ever really stepped back and said, architecturally, what data model do we need? What are all of the things we need to measure to be able to inform our leadership team so that they can make good decisions, right? Because when you do step back and you think about that, you end up building these very comprehensive data models. And then you say, okay, Now, how do we manipulate our tech stack, mostly typically the CRM and the marketing automation platform, in order to produce those data points? Right? And this is the first place most companies get it wrong, is they're not strategically thoughtful about data model and instrumentation of their tech stack. And so they aren't fundamentally even measuring the right stuff to begin with. They measure a lot of good stuff, but it's 20% of what they need to be measuring in most cases. The second part so there's really three issues with data. The first is they haven't even established the right data model or instrumentation. The second issue is data hygiene. So unfortunately, think about a manufacturing floor where all the robots and stuff each themselves generate data. Right? The good news about all the data that comes off a manufacturing floor, it's all computer generated, so the data hygiene is usually good. Contrast that with the go-to-market world, where the data is largely based on the way salespeople or SDRs interact with the tools. It's based on the way marketing people load lists and whether they put the right source tags and all that stuff onto the lists that they load. And so you end up with all of these data hygiene issues because there's so much human involvement in the creation of that data. And there's two required ways to solve that, both of which are required. One is you have to put monitoring in place. You basically have to establish protocols and mechanisms to monitor for data hygiene issues, because there's no point analyzing dirty data, right? Because you're better off going on gut than making decisions off of dirty data, because you'll make bad decisions then. And so you need to have a way to monitor, surface, identify where you've got bad data. The second thing is you do need some compliance to process. And this is where I said earlier, you asked me, beyond just getting good at data, what else do companies need to do? And I said, well, you need to get good people who are sensitive to that. Yeah. And that comes into play particularly on the sales leader, right? If your sales leader has this old school mentality of, hey, I'm just paid to deliver the number, as opposed to, I'm paid to deliver the number this quarter, but I'm also paid to establish a process, a machine here, et cetera, that will help us grow much faster looking forward. That first person isn't going to care. So they'll never hold their salespeople responsible for interacting with the CRM in a way that's actually strategically helpful to the company. The second person will. So you need to be able to monitor and identify bad data, but you also need to have a corporate mindset or corporate culture that values process compliance when it comes to using the tech stack. Then the second part, so that's the part that makes sure you have good data. Yep. The second part is, how do we make the analysis of the data actually scalable, right? And that's really a challenge, right? If you're producing good data, there's a lot of it. And simply picking 5 or 6 KPIs doesn't help, because what's interesting in the go-to-market motion is these points of friction are always changing. Do you know the arcade game Whack-A-Mole? Yeah, it's like that. Yeah. You no sooner fix something that something else broke over here. And so you don't actually know at any given point in time which data is the most important for me to look at. And that's why you need tool sets to help make the process of analyzing data scalable. That's where scale matters comes in actually on both parts of that. Interestingly enough, since we deal with growth stage companies and we know that generally speaking, their data is not very good, part of our platform is an instrumentation layer. So we actually put instrumentation into our customers' environments that produces the data that we need. And then we have this embedded data hygiene monitoring, so we are able to quickly identify when there's data that's gotten south, right? That's the requirement, so that we make sure there's good data. The real value that a user of our platform experiences is in the scalability of analysis. It just makes the way the platform's structured makes it so much easier for an analyst or even a senior revenue leader to quickly be able to understand what's going on, what's important at any time, where should they focus their attention. So those are really the benefits, if you will. But both of those issues need to be solved, whether by Scale Matters or anyone else. Is you have to first focus on having good data. And then secondly, you got to figure out how do you make the process of analyzing it scalable.
To wrap things up, Scott, is there an aspect or two around this whole idea of go-to-market efficiency and building that in that you find doesn't get much airtime, doesn't get talked about very much? If so, what would they be?
First of all, if you go back 2 or 3 years, well, first of all, again, in my world, growth stage companies, let me distinguish between VC-backed and PE-backed. Okay. PE-backed have always had some level of focus on efficiency, right? They run by rule of 40. They generally don't want their companies losing money. They're not necessarily trying to be extraordinarily profitable, but they are definitely more focused on efficiency. Up until a year and a half ago, virtually nobody that was VC-backed cared about efficient growth. It was growth at all costs because there's so much money being frivolously thrown at these companies. So we have certainly seen a macro level sea change to where now everybody talks about efficient growth or sustainable growth or whatever you want to call it. Where I'd say the disconnect is there's a disconnect between the investor community, who all very much value efficient growth now, the CEO and CFO of a company, who tend to be the most connected to their investors and board, and therefore they also think about efficient growth. And then it tends to stop. So and we spend a lot of time, basically we only talk to 3 types of people for the most part: heads of sales, heads of marketing, those which might own both, and heads of RevOps. They all acknowledge, it's almost universally, they acknowledge that there is now more pressure for efficient growth. But they do that in response to us asking, hey, times have changed. If people seem to care more about efficiency, how's that changed at your company? I was, oh, yeah, that's all we talk about. And then we go through the rest of the conversation, and you can tell they never actually think that way. The head of sales is still all he or she is worried about is, I got to make my number this month, this quarter. And so I think your question was whether there's any disconnect around this efficiency thing. I think it has not translated beyond lip service beneath the CFO and CEO at a company, because too many companies are still going through the same old motions they've always gone through. Sales leaders are still thinking, I need more heads. If I need to get more sales, I need more heads. It doesn't work that way.
Yep.
And I think it will change. It just takes a while. Think about it. We've conditioned, unfortunately, for sales and marketing leaders, they tend to have just a very short tenure at companies. What is it on average? Maybe a year and a half. So we've conditioned them to be pretty short-term thinking. Yeah. And unfortunately, short-term thinking ends up with those kind of outcomes, which is you don't think about how do we actually prepare our company for the longer term to grow more effectively.
So it'd be more of a culture issue that needs to be addressed.
Yeah, I think so. Okay. For sure.
Absolutely. Scott, if you were listening to this episode, what would you say would be your top takeaway?
You're asking me to remember what I've just said in the last hour. I think a couple, if I just think back, there's a few things that I think would be very helpful. Certainly the tips about how to test messaging, I think would be very helpful to a lot of CMOs. Yep. I also think potentially the rant about getting away from worrying about multi-touch attribution might be helpful, because if they spent less time thinking about that, they could spend more time thinking about stuff that actually matters. I also think this notion of the best in class companies are very good at data, and to be very good at data, you have to spend time strategically thinking about data, right? What is our data model? How are we going to instrument our environment to be able to produce that? How are we going to ensure data hygiene and data integrity? And then how are we going to be able to scalably analyze this stuff so it becomes an asset to us? I think all of those things are good points that could be useful to people.
Brilliant. And if listeners are curious, wanted to find out more or connect with you, where would you recommend they head to?
Certainly, if you can email me at Scott@Scale Matters. I typically look at every email, or I at least look at the first line, or email info@Scale Matters, or just go to our website, scalematters.com.
Right. We'll include links to that in the show notes. Scott, this has been brilliant. Thank you so much for doing this.
Vinay, I appreciate it. Had a good time with you, and thanks again for having me.